Hello everybody, today I have the pleasure of being joined by my friend Professor John Martin, who is a rural historian, which is something that's actually quite rare. I think there's not very many of you.
No, rural history is nowhere near as popular as it once was, and it's in many senses rather disappointing, given the fact that agriculture is so crucially important for the survival of our nation.
Yeah. So there's been a decline, you think?
I think there's been a decline in interest.
So would you like to introduce yourself, say a bit about how you came to be interested in agricultural history and what you've done?
Coming from a farming family, I was always very interested in agriculture, and I completed a PhD on the impact of government policies on agriculture in the Second World War. During this period, the state was forced to direct a food production campaign in a desperate attempt to ensure that the British population wasn't starved into submission.
Yeah, so this is obviously stuff that we've talked through on the channel in quite a lot of detail. This whole theme about Britain being almost intrinsically food insecure and us being reliant on imports was...
Well, Britain's reliance on imports was largely a reflection on the fact that historically it's been committed to a system of free trade, allowing food to be exported to Britain in exchange for the products of British manufacturing industries. And Britain was literally unique in the sense that it's the only country which is so dependent upon imported food in the 1930s. By then, in the region of 70% of food originated from overseas.
So we have this map that John has very kindly found for us that shows where Britain got its food from in the 1930s. So this map was a product of economic liberalism and a belief in free trade that prevailed, well, affected agriculture from about the 1870s when steamships and whatnot came to exist through to the Second World War. When it was fixed. And the difficulty that Britain found was that liberalism didn't provide a stable food supply.
Well, it was an unsecure food supply in the sense that we were heavily dependent upon imported food, and British food imports could actually be badly affected or undermined by the German U-boat campaign.
Would you say that liberalism in food is almost intrinsically a bad idea for such reasons?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily completely a bad idea, but what I would argue is the fact that you want food security in the sense that you don't want to import food long distances from countries which can't continue to guarantee to supply it in the future. There's the possibility of climate change, there's the possibility of disruption to international trade, there's the possibility of the imposition of tariffs, all of which could pose major threats for Britain's food supply. With Brexit, we're not absolutely sure what our attitudes to agriculture is. For example, we've seen the Labour government impose inheritance tax on farms, which could have a profound consequence for many farmers. And what really is our approach? Do we require a more supportive system of support for agriculture, or is it the fact that we want to move back to a kind of what we might regard as a neoliberal approach of allowing imports to flood into the country? I think there's inherent contradictions between the way in which we about the future of agriculture. On the one hand, we might have powerful environmental groups wanting us to farm in a particular way, like with the preservation of wildflower meadows, and then you might get kind of like the industrial groups committed to what you might call agricultural productivism, who want to maximise food production. These tensions are very difficult to resolve, and perhaps I'm not sure that successive governments have been able to address them as effectively as they might have done.
Yeah, well, this is, I think, quite a new thing, because these two positions, neither of them are the post-war vision in Britain, and neither of them really are the common agricultural policy that we had in Europe. So we've diverged from that, and then we've sort of hit this, it's like a T-junction, but we've sort of smacked into the other side of the road, I guess. We sort of haven't really gone either way, and that is what farmers are wrestling with. Which do you think will win of these two positions?
I'm not really sure. You might say that sitting on the fence seems to be the appropriate issue, given the fact that it's almost like there's two very important, powerful groups almost like fighting to gain control.
Yeah, but one of these groups has more money than the other. I would say the environmental movement has a lot of cultural power in metropolitan circles, but the corporate side of things have not only a very explicit profit incentive, but also the ability to lobby. And we are seeing with the committees that the government is convening, they're getting companies and the king around the table and talking to them about how best to run the countryside.
Well, obviously, we might see that as progress in the sense that they're actually beginning to engage in conversation with each other.
It's not with the National Farmers Union, though. They're shut out. It's corporations rather than farmers.
Mm. The power of the National Farmers Union has declined quite considerably, because in the 1940s it was the main negotiating group as to what is the future of agriculture. It was the group which the government consulted in terms of the annual price reviews. Today, it's nowhere near as powerful as it once was.
Right, so it used to be integrated with the government to a much greater extent, because I think the NFU would be a good thing to flesh out, because I feel a lot of frustration from farmers in the sort of protesting movements that we're seeing at the moment is that they want a union in the more traditional sense, where they want to collectively as workers go on strike, for example, and they use the term strike. We're filming this on the 2nd of April, and just a couple of days ago it was announced that there's going to be a wheat bread strike. Our industry isn't organised in the same way as, say, the train workers industry is, or the miners industry is.
Well, one of the problems is that it's really about the structure of the industry. With literally hundreds of thousands of farmers, it's a much diverse organisation, which is much more difficult to mobilise.
What do you make of the farmers' protests so far?
Well, obviously some of them have drawn attention to the very important challenges which agriculture faces. I think the farmers have got to be careful that they don't alienate the public too much. If we go have a food strike, it could actually backfire on their objectives.
Now, last time I saw you was before everything went absolutely crazy. One of the things that you said then was that you felt Britain was a very anti-farmer society.
I don't think it's very supportive of the farming community. It's supported it in the past, but it seems to almost like the attitudes to farming depend on the food supply. During the Second World War, when Britain was faced with a chronic shortage of food, the state made it a very determined effort to support farmers. With the emergence of food surpluses in the post-war period, this has changed significantly.
Yeah, so you think whether or not people like farmers is tied to the security of the food supply?
I think I think there's a close relationship between state attitudes to farmers and the food supply situation.
Right. So from that, we might expect that if there are food shortages, Britain may start to appreciate its farmers once again. Do you think?
I think with food shortages that we'll see a much more proactive and supportive approach to British farmers.
So just to put what's happening now in context, how have farmers traditionally organised?
Well, I think there's a long-term history of hardship, particularly amongst those people who worked on the land but weren't necessarily farmers. And this can be traced back to kind of like the medieval period when enclosures began to emerge and many people became landless labourers. With the 19th century, in the late 19th century, the landowners owned large aristocratic landowners owned the vast majority of the land and rented it out to tenant farmers who were really kind of like often compelled to carry out their instructions and to pay the rent. They were looking after the land and employing often very large numbers of agricultural workers, often at incredibly low rates.
Yeah.
The power of the farming community was quite limited in this period.
Actually, agricultural workers are something that I haven't really discussed on the channel, but they are I think less so today, but historically a distinct interest group in the countryside that are beneath that of farmers and as such often very disadvantaged.
Yeah, certainly I'd agree with that. Very disadvantaged, particularly in terms of their income standards and the way they're expected to work on the land.
Yeah, there is a BBC archive film going around, which I will again link in the description, that people have sent to me, that interviews people in the 1960s who worked on farms. And this isn't so much the case today, but they live in
tied cottages.
But the problem there, you see, is that they're getting very low wages, but the employer has the leverage of accommodation over them, so they can't really leave because then they'll be homeless.
During the First World War, the government actually provided guaranteed wage levels for agricultural workers. These were repealed in 1921, and consequently many agricultural workers suffered wage cuts in the 1920s. So the power of the agricultural workforce was clearly undermined following the resumption of a free trade system in agriculture in the early 1920s.
You all know more about this than me, but they had organised, there was a Farmworkers Union.
It was a Farmworkers Union, but it was very limited in terms of the number of farm workers who actually belonged to the union, and because of the diverse nature of employment, with many farm workers just being employed in either small groups, it was very difficult for them to exert power on the landowners and to negotiate improved conditions.
Yeah, and that is sort of the problem that farmers are facing today, which is that the industry's organisation doesn't lend itself to unionised action.
It doesn't lend itself to what you might call mass action, where you get concerted groups agreeing a common way forward.
The Workers' Union, as I understand it, was able to put forward some Labour MPs, so they were tied to the Labour Party in particular, but then as the number of workers has declined with mechanisation, it became defunct.
It merged with larger unions.
So this is distinct to the National Farmers Union, which is of course the union for farmers who were employing these people. When did that come about?
Well, that had its origins in the late 19th century, and with the idea of perhaps the farmers joining together to actually put pressure on the government. What's evident is that the power of the farming lobby is much more important during periods of food shortages, such as that of the First World War, and particularly the food shortages which existed in World War II. When the government introduces the 1947 Agricultural Act, the NFU is deemed to be the main group representing the interests of farmers and negotiating the annual price review changes which are taking place.
And during the war, Reginald Dorman Smith, who was the agriculture minister at the beginning, he was also the head of the NFU, I believe.
Yeah.
So they do have a very explicit link to government, which is something that I think, perhaps we could see again. I think Tom Bradshaw would actually make quite a good agriculture minister if a political party was willing.
Particularly in the 1940s, food shortages were actually more acute than they had been during the worst days of the Second World War. And you see the imposition of even more draconian rationing restrictions on the allocation of food.
So the NFU retained their influence into the post-war era, and then how would you say it's?
Well, as food shortages gradually become replaced by food surpluses, the power of the NFU invariably begins to wane.
So in a sense what you're suggesting here is that while farmers are able to organise, they can't really affect change on a meaningful scale, because how effective they are just depends on the government's policy, which has to do with them.
I would say slightly modify that by suggesting that the power of the farming community is obviously much more noticeable, evident during periods when there are food shortages. When we've got an abundant supply of food, some of which could be imported from overseas, then the power of the farming lobby is clearly undermined.
Are we in that situation today?
We certainly could be on the verge of it, particularly with America wanting us to import more food from because America's a large agricultural producer.
Yes. And do you think the NFU is good? Which is a very vague question. Do you think that we could have a better form of organisation for the industry, or Is the NFU sort
I
of the
think it
ideal
would be very
form?
difficult for the NFU to organise much more effectively, given the structure of the industry, with a large number of farmers not necessarily committed to the same policy objectives.
Was this the first organised representation of the farming sector in this country?
Well, I think that it depends what you mean by organisation. I mean, historically, the vast majority of land was owned by the aristocracy, who were powerfully organised in Parliament, and initially in the first half of the 19th century, they were still able to exert considerable influence in the way in which state policies favoured agriculture. The repeal of Corn Laws marks the decline in dominance, which continued throughout the late 19th century as the interests of the manufacturing sector became increasingly important, and they actually determined really what you might regard as government policies.
I see. So in that context then, the National Farmers Union and the Agricultural Workers Union rise. That's sort of where they come from.
I wouldn't say rise. Certainly the farmers become slightly more organised in terms of their own union, facilitated by the breakup of landed estates, which occurred or were prompted by the First World War.
And then on top of the NFU and the Agricultural Workers Union, there's also the CLA, which originally was the Central Landowners Association, which is the aristocratic trade association essentially, and it's since rebranded to the Country Land Business Association, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
And so that also still exists. And they're the three unions for the three sort of social classes in the countryside, would you say? The aristocracy, farmers, and agricultural labourers. But with these three distinct interest groups, if you like, although I think agricultural workers are diminished, we're in a bit of a weird situation now where everyone is sort of on the same side. And on this channel I make a lot about the friction between the interests of the aristocracy as the landowning class and farmers as the people who work and manage the land. But actually today the NFU and the CLA are very much on the same side, because it feels that the entire countryside is under very explicit attack from the government. And it feels to me like it's a very sort of new threat, particularly from the Labour Party. And a lot of people say that they're communists online and that it's a land grab. What do you make of what the government are trying to do with the inheritance tax, but also, of course, all of the other policies changes that we're seeing at the moment? What is the objective?
Certainly, I find it difficult to say there's any communist aspirations, but it may be that perhaps they're feeling that, given the present financial pressures, they want to be seen that agriculture is contributing more of its share to dealing with the challenges, and also perhaps indirectly it could be freeing up the land market so that more land is transacted. Only a very small amount of land is sold every year, and this might give the opportunity for organisations to develop solar power farms and other activities. If you look even at the war, that large-scale corporations have increasingly taken control over the countryside, and perhaps it's like a continuing extension of what's been previously taking place.
So do you think this is all in line with with the trends that have been observed since the war?
I think that we see clear signs of an acceleration of trends which became evident in the immediate post-war period.
And do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that depends on where you stand. I mean, for certainly many farmers, it might have a disastrous impact on the future of their own family.
Yeah, but what do you think? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
You've got to bear in mind the fact that if you have kind of like corporations taking over the land, they're much more likely to farm it according to economic criteria. And many farming families may have a genuine commitment to looking after the land and conserving it in a way which isn't necessarily always evident in terms of profit and loss terms.
Yeah, and do you think that would be worth preserving for the environment or cultural reasons, or for a sense of Britishness over the economic imperative?
I'd say that from a point of view of diversity, maintaining environmental diversity, preserving the land is crucially important.
There you go, an environmental case against corporate control of the countryside. Professor John Martin, thank you very much for featuring on the channel. It has been a pleasure.
Nice to talk to you.